Maria Ressa, do you think the Filipino public care about your fate and indeed the fate of other journalists in your country? Because one looks at Duterte's approval ratings, they are consistently above 80% approval, the kind of figure that other leaders around the world could only dream about. And the Filipino public are well aware of what he's doing to the press.
I think there are two answers to that question. The first one is the kinds of the propaganda machine and how it uses technology to essentially use it as a behavioral modification system. And I can explain that more later. But the propaganda is exponential and it lifts. When you hear President Duterte is the best, the defender of the poor, even though it's the poor who are dying in the drug war, right? So that's the first step. I think, the age of social media, statistical surveys haven't been able to keep up with these shifts. The second one is, do people care? Yes. And I can see that just based on what's happened. And I think this in particular in 2020, three things have happened. We've had a pandemic, the lockdown. We are just in our 14th week of a very security-driven, militaristic lockdown. It's a lockdown when President Duterte has told Filipinos to stay at home. And he told troops that if they come out, if we break quarantine, he told them to, and this is a direct quote, he said, shoot them dead. That did happen. Almost more than 60,000 people have been arrested during this time period. And because we're locked down, I think there's been more introspection. The second is the shutdown.
I'm going to stop you there, if I may,
yeah.
because it's fascinating what you're saying, but I'm just wondering where your evidence is, because I look at the latest polling I can find in the Philippines. There's a company I'm sure you know well, Social Weather Stations, who are widely respected, and their measurements suggest that the Filipino public as a whole approves still of President Duterte's campaign against illegal drugs. They still seem to favor him, despite all of the controversy about his latest anti-terror law, which you and others have described as a fundamental threat to freedom of expression.
That's the third one, right? That's the third one I was going to say, this anti-terror bill.
You have to get real, in a way. Everything you say about what Duterte is doing is not deterring a really big majority of Filipinos from giving him their backing.
I think you have to look at the surveys and actually talk to the people who do the surveys. And the biggest question you have to ask them is, how do you count for fear? So before we went into lockdown, this was a question I asked all the time, because these surveys are done in the homes of people. They have their numbers, they know who they are. They're normally, their names are given by their village chiefs, the barangay captains. How do you account for fear, right? So not saying that President Duterte isn't popular, because I think his homespun, this kind of, the guy you want to have a beer with, the grandfather you want to have a beer with, that's the narrative. I think that's appealing.
Yes,
but having said that, how do you count for fear? Right?
Interesting question.
Now,
and I tell you what, that plants in my mind a different idea about fear. Maybe for you, and let's be honest, for a relatively elite personality living in a nice part of Manila with perhaps more security than most Filipinos, it is easy for you to focus on the threats to freedom which you feel and the fear you talk about. But what about the other Filipinos whose fear is much more street level? It's much more about the insecurity. And your Rappler website has made a point of investigating the drugs war that Duterte has initiated for the last 3-4 years. But the drugs war, according to most Filipinos, has made their streets safer. Yes, they look at the fact that hardly any security personnel have been prosecuted for egregious use of violence, but they also look at the fact that thousands of drug dealers have been taken off the streets, and they like that.
I think that's definitely the narrative, but if you dig deeper into the surveys, number one, and this is based on the UN report, one just released a few weeks ago, you can see that the people who die in the drug war are the poor. And you can also see in those surveys, it's not just the social weather stations, it's also Pulse Asia, you can see that President Duterte's support among the poorest of the poor has dwindled significantly compared to the AB, the people who are wealthy, who can cut the deals. You know, I always say there are three things that really characterize living under the age of Duterte. You have to do one of these three things. The three C's: corrupt, coerce, or co-opt. And it isn't the poor that does that. In fact, I would say the poor suffers the most. So you look at this brutal drug war, depends on who you talk to. If you talk to the police, they'll say, oh, well, maybe about 6,000 to 7,000 people have died. They admit to that. And then you talk to the human rights groups and they say it's tens.
Thank you for watching. Please click like and subscribe for more Philippines news today. Have a nice day.